For this last session of the first day of the America's Long-Term Crisis Reporting Fellowship, we are quite privileged to have an experienced journalist who is not only broken barriers in this industry in so many different ways, but who also has a profoundly moving personal story to tell about long-term care. Richard Lui is, I'm sure, someone you all recognize, or you should recognize. He's the breaking news anchor for MSNBC. He has anchored for NBC. He's actually, quite famous when you think about it that way. But also incredibly cool, incredibly accessible, and incredibly generous in his willingness and desire to talk about his own personal experience in caregiving for first his father and now your mother as well. I have to tell you that I told you yesterday that I listened to Sandeep Jauhar's book through Audible. Well, Richard has also has a book on Audible called Enough About Me. It's about being selfless, the power of selflessness in caregiving and in so many other ways. But I wanted to explain to you why one of your fellows has joined us up front. Alex Lowe is actually Richard's assistant, which I didn't realize when we selected him. And Richard and I have been torturing him about how we were going to make him pay for. No, but Richard actually is having some vocal challenges. His voice is kind of leaving him at the moment. So Alex is going to try to fill in as possible. His whole career is on the line here, so let's be gentle with Alex.
Try and be his ventriloquist.
There you go.
He'll move his mouth and all the voice will come out here.
But Richard, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's great to be here.
I want you to actually start with a moment, and again, listening to the actual author read their book on Audible really adds a depth of impact to it. Torture?
Torture, yeah.
But also, you really sort of are able to stand in the shoes of the person you're listening to. But I want you to describe the moment after you had gotten this new gig at MSNBC, and all of a sudden you realize, I'm going to have to make the decision about caring for my father.
Mm. First of all, thanks for doing this and gathering us here in D.C. I think it's such an important topic, and it's great to see everybody here. As was said, I apologize for my vocal challenges. It'll come and go as we are speaking today. And Alex was the producer on the first and second films regarding caregiving, and he's a caregiver himself, which I'm sure he'll bring up shortly. And for me, it was, I actually felt that it was a little unfair, after fighting for so long to get an anchor title. And then what happened was, it took me about, I don't know, 15 minutes, maybe an hour. So in reality, maybe about a week, when I decided I was going to have to do something if I wanted to care for my dad, because he would have done the same for me. And he did all throughout my life. And despite what that job was, and he loved the fact, I remember when I got the job and I called him from CNN Center, and I said, I'm actually at CNN Center. I'm looking at from the hotel up at that sign, and it's that neon that's going CNN. I said, I'm going to quit my job and do this thing. And he laughed. And he said, I always knew you were a special kid, and meaning that, I'd always had zigged when others zagged. And so I gave up what was my business trajectory to do that. And that started what was 7 or 8 years of long distance caregiving, traveling from New York to San Francisco. I always say I couldn't have been any farther unless he was in Guam, which I'm glad he did not decide to be in Guam, because that would have been quite the trip from New York. But, after putting in about 250, 300,000 miles a year, really didn't hit me until the 5th year. 5 years of that, and then started telling a lot of stories about the caregiving community and It actually, the beginning of the storytelling actually began with somebody who works in this building.
Really?
Really? Daphne Kwok, who works here at AARP, said, we'd like to do some videos on people of different backgrounds that we can show that, because in this space, as many of you know, every difference counts even more, or becomes more apparent. At least it does, I believe. Just like during COVID, all the differences in the dents and the freckles in our society started to come out, right, during these tough times. So in the caregiving context, she wanted to have different stories of different folks with different backgrounds. And so she asked me, can we film your family? And I was like, want to film me doing what? I mean, I'm just going home, taking care of Dad, and coming back to work. And, well, let's do it. I said, okay. And that was the beginning. Because I looked at it and I said, oh, now I get it. Because I had to do a little bit of investigation, how much 53 million, which we all know is undercounted now. $500 billion a year, we all know that's undercounted now. I was like, that is huge. So every little bit in this caregiving economy needs more stories told about it. Because if we have that amount of unrealized value, $500 billion a year, I believe it's like 650, 700 now, and we have 53 million, probably 65 now, and that makes it the most popular job in America times 10. I think the retail worker segment is about 5 or 6 million, but we don't talk about it. So as journalists, all of us, right, that's what we do. We see something like that and we go, wow, there's a cultural, informational, contextual gap. And it started with Daphne Kwok on, I guess she's on the 5th floor, I don't know, 5th floor. And she said, let's film you. And that started it.
I'm going to let you rest your voice now, and we'll go to Alex. First, tell us about your caregiving story, and then I want you to explain or describe the two films that you worked on with.
I didn't call myself a caregiver at first. I didn't even really know the term at first, like I think so many who do this feel. It started with helping take care of my grandmother with her Alzheimer's. And, and part of why I wouldn't have called myself a caregiver at first was because that was in small ways. It was helping out my folks, my parents, my aunts and uncles, whether it was, driving her to the doctor's appointment or helping to pick up the prescriptions or, running some small errands.
How old were you when you first found out?
I would have been in early years of high school, so 14, starting at that really young age. And what we found in our reporting is that is really common. There are millions of kids who are going through this, some as young as 7 years old, who are helping out in some small way. And they might not know the word caregiver or be familiar with it like I was, but they are still doing that part of the job. They are still part of this story, part of the team.
So tell your fellow fellows about Sky Blossom.
Yeah, so Sky Blossom, we started working on that film 7 years ago, came out 2 years ago after a couple years of shooting out in the field, 2 years of editing, and about 150 people, myself and Richard included on the team, 80% of them who were caregivers themselves, putting this together. And we profiled 5 families across the country, 5 different kids who were taking care of a loved one. And all of them happened to be in military families as well. So 2 kind of interesting intersections there in the caregiving world of it, both being military families and child caregivers, which adds a whole lot of other dimensions to the story. In military families, this is something that starts so much younger than typical, because when a service member comes back with an injury, that is something that happens at a much younger age and can go for a lot longer. So the duration of the caregiving journey can be a lot longer too. Also, the severity of what they're going through oftentimes can be so much more intense. So this is a journey that lasts longer, is much more difficult, and you throw in the element of kids being involved in that too and being a part of the care. That makes it all that much more, I think, of a compelling story.
And just on Sky Blossom, the reason why children were chosen was from the perspective of caregiving's kind of ho-hum, kind of a downer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you pitch it out to your editor, they're going, what do you want to tell a story about? Do we need more information on this thing? And so Rachel, the approach there was children. Well, that was a question, right? Because we knew that if a bunch of folks my age or older as the protagonists, right, in it, who wants to watch that? Well, there's a lot of ha-ha and ho-hum, as we all know, in caregiving. And so that's why we chose children, especially when we found out that there are 5 million 17 and younger who are family caregivers. And that within itself all of a sudden broke it open, that this is not what we think it is. It is far wider, far deeper. And also what's important, this is the group that are, as we all say, every generation, they're our future. And this is why we called the first film, Sky Blossom, Diaries of the Next Greatest Generation.
You know, these two speakers also illustrate another theme that we talked about in one of our earlier sessions, and that is when we're trying to get editors to be interested in these stories, women caregiving is like, everybody knows that women do all the caregiving, and that's not a story. But male caregivers.
Yeah.
You go into a newsroom and say, you know, a man like Sandeep Jauhar yesterday, but certainly these two men have very powerful experiences. Is that something that you feel like it could be a good pitch for the journalists here?
You know, I think that's a great angle, in addition to youth. And there's a lot of, so the gap on children and boys and girls doing this is that all of a sudden they all melt together when you're talking about children. And to see them in their conflict and their sacrifice at such an early age. Well, I remember when we were in high school, we were struggling already with who we were. Maybe we still are. Maybe I still am. And then they add on this other dynamic of coming home to something else. And so when we have military added in, and we have the age group added in, you have the different genders. So that's what we showed in Sky Blossom. We had, we were filming lots of families. Second film, we have two two boys that are caregivers. And then in the first one, we have two, I believe, right? One. One. We have one, Kaleo. And then the rest are 4 girls. Yet we know the numbers. I know that you were discussing this earlier, right? We're now at 45% in the United States in terms of male caregivers for those who decide to raise their hand. But if you were to ask anybody out of the blue, it's going to be 2 out of 10. So even though those statistics may say 4, we all know the other layer on top of it is we don't like to raise our hand. None of us do as caregivers, and especially in the male construct and the way that societal roles put them in. We went into it not really thinking about that, though, Rachel. We knew that we had to, in our best ability, to represent that. And that was just one of the crosstabs.
Before I let you rest your voice again, tell us a little bit about your father.
So my dad was a social worker for, I guess, 35 years. And so his last beat, or his last obligation, was to serve the senior population in San Francisco. And before that, he had served what they called GA, which is you walk off the street, and if you need help, he's the person you sit down and you speak with. He got struck one time, and that really put him aback, because it was the dynamic of I'm trying to help, but I'm there's, somebody's physically assaulting me. So he moved then into seniors. And so I think when he got Alzheimer's, the joke I like to tell is that, I get 2 films on caregiving and a book that involves selflessness and care. He's also a pastor. So I was thinking, he may have Alzheimer's, but he's really faking it. He's laughing all the way to the bank going, I got my errant son to do these things that he wouldn't have done otherwise. But I think, and I'm glad you asked. They never, my parents never said, this is what you must do, or they kind of just did it. And I think so all of you who are reporting on caregiving, sometimes I know you feel like you might be the only people in the world that are in our profession or in your space, but it's changing somebody, and somebody is listening long term. I think when we did the movies, we knew that it may be a tree falling in a forest. We really did. So we focused on distribution from the first film and the second film from the very beginning.
Alex, tell us about Unconditional. Tell us about the screening at the White House.
Yeah,
that was so cool.
Yeah, Unconditional. So we came out with it last May after about 7 years working on this film, and it follows 3 families. Richard's family is one of them, who are going through caregiving. But they're not just talking about that caregiving experience, they're also talking about how it affected them personally in terms of their mental health, as that's been such a big topic of conversation. When we were out there talking with caregivers, oftentimes we would always hear, how can I take care of myself? Because you can't take care of someone else without taking care of yourself. And I think that's what it really showed. So this was we brought back the same team from Sky Blossom to do it, filming these 3 families really coming from across different parts of the country. So Richard's family in San Francisco, there's family in Alaska, a family here in Northern Virginia, and all of them sharing that story, very personal stories, very vulnerable stories about how they were able to do that, how they were able to take care of themselves. And yeah, we were really lucky to be able to get it out there. Richard talked about the distribution part, which is such a core part of what we do, because these are stories that we really believe need to be seen and be out there in all sorts of different places. So, and some of those places, are places like the White House or Congress, where we had a screening a couple of weeks after for members of Congress, or we're also working right now on a screening at the United Nations to get it out there too. So all of these different venues where we knew that it needed to be seen and recognized as something that's important, as a topic that's important, and that's really why we did it.
Tell us a little bit about the reporting and producing aspect. For me, I'm always fascinated about. I was at NPR, so I know you do a ton of interviews, and then you pick the best ones. But for video, tell us a little bit about how you just go through reams and reams and reams of interviews and decide which ones are the best.
Sure. I mean, with each film, we had probably about 100 hours worth of footage, and the movie is 90 minutes long. So you're really only seeing about 1% of what we had. So you're seeing the best 1% of all of that footage. And with each of the families that we filmed with, we filmed for 3 different visits, and each of those visits about 3-4 days. With us on the ground, grabbing interviews, trying to shoot what we call verite scenes, which is just them going about their daily lives, and we're just fly on the wall and seeing what happens. We're not trying to make things happen, but we're just sitting there and observing, and that all gets cut together into the film. And one thing that we did, which was maybe a little bit different in terms of our process editorially, was for each of those families, we started with just making a short film, 20 minutes long, which was just about them, just to understand what is the story arc for that family at the beginning, middle, and end. And that really helped us to identify that. So that way, when we brought all of the different families that were in the film together, we had a really clear sense of structure. And you could start to see the parallels within each family's journey. And then in Unconditional, because Richard is kind of our narrator talking us through it, we could figure out what are those pieces of connected tissue that Richard could make as our narrator and storyteller to connect all of those journeys together.
Richard, so much of, certainly people in my generation, I'm not quite sure if we're in the same generation here.
Of course we are. We're all in the same generation.
Well, if you want to look at
We're
it
all in-
humanistically, maybe.
We're all in Generation Care.
Chronologically is another story. But but we're taught to keep arm's length, to not get too involved in the story, to be objective. And so I want to have you talk about the emotional impact of sharing this very intense personal journey for you. Were you prepared for how it affected you, or give us?
Was not prepared. And the first one was the beginning of my caregiving journey. And as we did the second one, it was at the end of my caregiving journey, at least with my father. And I didn't know the beginning, middle, or end, or what that was going to be like. The approach in the interviews and the first time out was, do they want to talk to me? These are at the time 7-year-olds up to 26-year-olds, and I'm going to sit down and talk to them about caregiving. And when I bring up that word, the first time I use it, they're almost 90% of the time, which all of you know who've done these stories, they go, "What? What is that? I'm daughter, I'm son, I'm wife, I'm husband. Why are you using these strange words?" And so I started to shift my questioning of what caregiving was to, actions, skills, and beginning. And I was obviously asking about something I was living through at the time. So I got a twofer. I was getting some learning. I got a threefer. I got some learning, I got some community, and I was doing a project that I thought was important. We picked films, by the way, because when I saw that there was such a cultural gap, where do we find big things and big ideas typically in at least on video media? It's going to be in the films. It's going to be in the theater. So we swung for the fences on that one. And the interesting thing about those interviews is that when I remember with Darren Allen in Tennessee, McMinnville, and we come down and we've got our setup and our crew. And our crew's small. It's like 5 people, 6 people, and we use Interatron. Bad word. Just like because you tell them we're going to use an Interatron, like what? Which is, for those of you who've used it, but it is just a screen. And it is a video of me, even though I'm sitting just 3 feet behind that screen, so that they're staring right into the camera. And the person who invented it called it an Interatron, and it sounds
terrifying.
Yeah, very terrifying. And Darren sat there, and I think she felt like the first interview. I'm not sure if she was, but she immediately grabbed on to our shared experience and shared things I don't think she ever had shared before. And she, before that, was a kind of a quieter 15-year-old in Tennessee, and me coming from New York with all this stuff and using the word Interatron. And I knew immediately where we had to go with this conversation, just like where we go with caregiver to caregiver, is there's an immediate understanding. If you ever gone to an Alzheimer's Association event, and I was called a Baptist revival, it's because everybody knows there are survivors and their family members of those who they've lost. And I've never hugged so many people in my life. And the same thing with interviewing Darren and David and all the rest. It was one-to-one, human to human. What I love about this story space is that regardless, and that's why I said we're Generation Care, is that in these spaces, all of that melts away. I was in the South, I was in the Midwest, I was in the East, the West, the Pacific Islands. I was with Latino, Black, API, Indigenous, and white families. And it all went away. So the great thing about this story space is that it melts it all away. It's also a great quality that we should be focusing on right now, which I think we have a little bit of deficit, and that's caring.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions because I could hog this conversation all day. Does anyone have any questions before I start hogging again?
Just make it up.
Heidi DeMarco. I'm a multimedia health reporter. And how I found out about your amazing films is because I featured the Alvarado family in my rising of child caregiver stories during COVID. And I just wanted to ask you about, about the resources for these children.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot when I was speaking to these experts saying how the number keeps rising, but resources aren't there for them. And then also the cultural expectations. I mean, you interviewed so many children from different backgrounds of, you said, it's just kind of expected, and they grow up with I'm not a caregiver. This is something that I do, even if you're 7 years old. So.
And Heidi, the amazing thing about that is, so she's talking about the Alvarados. They're in Long Beach, California. It's a Marine family. They were in Sky Blossom. Rihanna, at the time, was 11. She would often go with walks with her father, who had 3 different types of cancers. And he had worked in the burn pits. That most of our veterans have worked in the burn pits, which are these big garbage piles where garbage and the fumes they'd inhale it, and then they'd get all sorts of sicknesses. And it's only in the last year and a half that we've seen any sort of help, legislation, and identification of this is actually happening. With the Alvarados, Rihanna would go out with her dad, and her dad, because of his 3 cancers, would have a very narrow neck because he had a throat cancer. He talked through a trach. He was very underweight, probably about 40% underweight, and people would point at him. And what was beautiful about what Rihanna did, what she would do, Ree is what we call her, but what Rihanna would do is she would point to them and she'd tell them to turn around. She'd go like this. And the way we learned that, it's one of my favorite scenes in the documentary, is because I asked her, so what do you do when people do that to your dad? And she's just sitting there smiling, and she goes, turn around. And the interesting thing about her, as you know, is that she's also autistic. She's also on the spectrum. And so she learned her young life, people making fun of her. So they're not doing so well now. Brian is... They are looking for resources. Brian, unfortunately, has had a resurgence. And I remember the crew, when we left the first filming, they're like, Richard, what are we going to do? Is Brian going to make it? I remember that. And I was like, we don't know. And that's the film we're doing. When crews go out with you and the first time they're out, they're kind of getting a sense of what you're about to do. And the crew left. And I remember we're out in the truck loading up, said, oh, we're not just leaving, are we? I said, yeah, we are leaving. When are we coming back? And we have, through some NGOs, reached out to get them specific help. But you're absolutely right, Heidi. This is why we need to talk about it, because the amount of resources that are there on the ground for caregivers is kind of haphazard. Not kind of, it is haphazard. Every one of you who've gone through this and reported on, I know many of you have done this for a long time, you know that every caregiver feels like they're creating the system by themselves. And they feel like they're by themselves. And that means I think we've got a huge issue, and it's a culture problem. It's a big culture, and that's the long game, right? But if we don't fix the culture, then we're never going to get the little things, the meals. And they're not little, but the ADLs, right? How do we help with the ADLs and activities of daily living? And it's kind of tough to pitch a culture story to the editor. It really is. I know that. And so for us with these films, we did it outside of the organization and then brought it back in. Because we knew inside it would be like, what do you want to do? How long you want to do this? And so we got it done outside, and that's the only way we're able to do it, because we knew that the way we're going to help the Alvarados was through culture. And we may not be able to help them directly every day, even though I was talking with Brian about the same formulas we were giving my dad. So we were giving my dad fat formulas, and Brian also needed fat formulas because he needed to put more fat on his bone. He didn't have any meat on his bones. And so we were sharing. There's so many things we can share as caregivers, and we would spend after every shoot, like maybe 30 minutes going, so what are you doing about this issue, and how are you handling it? And my dad's living with Alzheimer's. He was living with 3 different types of cancers. So there's so many great overlaps in all these conversations, and we do feel helpless because we know right now Brian's not doing well. Exactly what the crew was asking 5 years ago is now happening today.
Hi, Natalie Mejia, Women's Health. I'm curious to know how you went about choosing the subjects that you did for the film. And I guess my question is twofold because you said you were working with 100 hours of footage. So when you were making the final edits, how did you go about selecting what stories to put in the final cut? Were there common themes you were looking at? Yeah.
I guess maybe I'll take the first part of the question. We worked with different NGOs who are really on the ground to help identify those families. So I think we had a spreadsheet where we maybe had about 50 or so that were under consideration. And some of the things, we were looking for very specific things in terms of the stories that we wanted to tell. So, Richard alluded to the diversity that's in that film, geographic, ethnic, in terms of, the health conditions that they're dealing with, even the branch of service that they were in. We wanted to make sure that all those different things were represented. So we were we had a really clear vision of kind of what profiles we wanted. And in collaboration with those NGOs, we're able to help identify some families that might be candidates. In the end, we shot with, I think about 10 or 11 families, which then, got cut down to 5 for Sky Blossom. And then we used some of the additional families in the second film, Unconditional. The reason, some of them didn't make the final cut, I think, is because, it's tough to be so vulnerable on camera. I mean, if I was there and it was my family that was being profiled, I don't know that we would have been able to give enough, to be so open and with our big team out there shooting for hours and hours.
They felt they gave too much.
Yeah.
Or they felt that they needed to be perfect. Mm-hmm. Right? And a lot of these families want to be perfect in their care for their loved ones. And it's hard we can only tell them so many times, because I would say, I'm doing it and I'm making lots of mistakes. Yeah. So they wouldn't give enough during the interview. So that's why at the end, we really appreciated their help, but to help others in the story, we had to, pull back.
Right. So, that's kind of how we got to that final, group after a lot of deliberation and a lot of time, 2 years in the edit room of trying to figure out what those stories would be.
Yeah, and part of that is, and be very honest and straightforward and transparent about this. If you think about where we were in the country and where we are today 7 years ago, and this is not about any part of the political spectrum, left or right. It's just about the energy that was happening, was a lot about division and separation. And my gut was that caregiving was that secret sauce. And we were right. We were right, I believe. Not that it took a rocket scientist to figure that out. And so I did go in wanting to represent every geography. And I wanted to represent all major groups of ethnicity in the film. And because we had too much regional separation and too much racial division at the time. And so we went in thinking, okay, how do we express this? And so in the film, what you'll find in Sky Blossom is we're not going, here is your, and here is your, and here is your. No, we're not saying that at all. We're just showing you what is America in the context of caregiving. And so that was one of our crosstabs. We had so many crosstabs that we wanted to get done, and a lot of you do. I know in all of our storytelling, we have our lead, we have our profile, and then we know we want to get some other things done along the way. And we weren't able to achieve all of the crosstabs, but I think the major ones, just by being great stories, it really, really worked out well. And so that's how we, at the end, chose them. Did we answer all your questions or not yet? I'm not sure we did. Did we? We did, okay. So I'm so used to people saying, you didn't answer the question. So that's why I'm saying, feel free. We all do that. That's what our job is, right? You didn't answer my question. Common themes of from each of the families. Did you? I think he's got a quick one.
For Sky Blossom with the child caregiving, I think one thing that we and this is why the name of the film became Sky Blossom: Diaries of the Next Greatest Generation. I think the common theme that we saw just as observers in each of those families was just the heroism that you saw in these kids, right? Richard talked about Rihanna, right, 11 years old, telling bullies basically of her dad to turn around, right? And you saw that, and you see that in each of the 5 families that you profiled, like examples of things they did. Maybe they might seem little on the outside, but really big heroic things that they could do that were that were deserving of
They were
that.
truly hidden heroes. I mean, that's the name that the Dole Foundation calls the group, but at the time, the Dole Foundation was not concentrating on youth caregivers at that time. And the title of their campaign was Hidden Heroes. And I think at the time, we really believed these were hidden heroes. Sky Blossom is a term that comes from World War II. And when the troops behind the front lines needed either medical help or fortification with more troops, they'd send in. World War II was the first war where we used a lot of air power, and they would drop the paratroopers in, and the parachutes would open up, and the troops on the ground would look up and talk to each other and go, "Here come the Sky Blossoms." And so we really believe that these children behind the front lines, they're Sky Blossoms. And they're also young, and they're blossoming into the next greatest generation, and they're in military families. So that's the commonality. That's how we struggled with the name as well. It took us, we had a list of a whole bunch of names, and the story behind Sky Blossom, I think, is so powerful to who they are and what is so gratifying to the values that we all care about.
Marquita Brown, freelance writer and editor from based out of Northern Virginia. And so, Richard, you talked a little bit about wanting to help. Was it Brian, the father?
Yeah, Brian Alvarado. Mm-hmm.
And that made me think about how there seems to be increasing conversations about partnering with people to tell their stories and to make the storytelling mutually beneficial if possible, not one-sided or exploitative. And so I was wondering, how did that sort of thinking factor into the storytelling that you all did, if at all, and how has it changed over time?
In terms of exploiting the family?
Exactly, right.
Yeah. The one thing I did when I approached the Marquita was to say, I'm a caregiver too, and I'm in my journey. And a majority of our team are caregivers or have lived through the caregiving journey. And what I learned from covering human trafficking for 15 years was that I came back one time after filming May in Indonesia, and she was 13, and she was enslaved in a brothel. And I did the story. I talked to my editors at Standards and Practices, at CNN. We did the undercover filming. We came back and we edited it. Everybody was watching it, make sure we got it right. And I still felt unsure and unwell about it 2 years later because I left. And even though we only saw May here down during the interview, I don't think that I was there properly for the story. And so with the caregiving story, I told each family when we sat down, as I said, I'm a caregiver and I'm not going to leave the story. I'm going to be there for every single part of where it's going to go. And I'm going to stay with the Dole Foundation. I'm going to stay with all these other NGOs. I'm going to make sure that when we're talking about it, I am not somebody else. If I can be there, I'll do it. I was there for every edit meeting of all of our films, and I was sat through every single frame for sound and color. I watched every single frame, and I made that promise to them. And I think for this space, and not that we all have the time to do it, but many of you who have done caregiving stories know that you want to do that, is that I made sure I would stay there for every part of the process and after. I know they want more, and like the Alvarados, I wish I could give more. I want to give more. And, we were just talking the other day because we had spoken with Rocio, who's the wife, caring for him. How can we help her? That's within reason. And there's several NGOs that know of them too. So I think that is the way we approached it, to make sure that what we thought was imbalance of what our profession is, as well as imbalance who we are as people, and what is good societally to do in this storytelling space. And I think working with NGOs and CBOs very closely and embedding yourself with them. So, I'm an ambassador over at the Dole Foundation in their Hidden Heroes campaign. I don't know. I haven't had to take on any political positions. I don't go to the Hill to lobby for any legislation. I don't cover the legislation. All I do is I talk about caregivers. That's it. And my work has allowed me to do that. And I think we're now allowed today to do things we couldn't do 20 years ago. There is no way.
Absolutely.
Right? 20 years ago, if I went in there, they would say, well, that's really nice, Richard. And, you can definitely hug all the trees you want and wear your Birkenstocks, but not in this job. And that's the beauty of today, is that because the market is blown up, this is one of the good things, is we can now do that, and it's not the end of our career, right? We don't have to say, no, we have to leave journalism.
Was there another? Okay, let's take two more.
Hi, I'm Nina Keck with Vermont Public, and thanks for this talk. It's been great. I kind of what you were just talking about, being so involved, I was wondering, as both of you being caregivers, if it impacted how you edited, because maybe your own emotions from being a caregiver, you're like, oh, let's not show that, because it brought up your own regrets, shame. I don't even know, just all of the disappointments we feel that we're not good enough as caregivers, but just being so involved, if it affected your edits that you could make if you weren't so involved.
Yeah. That's it. I'm joking. Yeah, it's funny because, and I can tell you're also a caregiver. Yes. And by the way, when I talk about caregivers, is one sort of philosophical thing is, once a caregiver, always a caregiver. Once you're an astronaut, you're always an astronaut, right? Once you go to the moon for your loved one, you do not take away that title. You are forever a caregiver. It was like a therapy session. So it was Alex as the producer during Unconditional, which was focused on mental health. That was a 2-year edit. I'm a broadcast news person. A long edit is 4 hours. So when we were editing for 2 years, and we had meeting after meeting, and the meetings were not, they were good. They were not bad. They were good. They were fruitful. And we were trying to go through the frames and try to describe why we're seeing certain things and why we want to put in certain things. And I would say, Alex, and I would like to hear feedback, is that it was a lot of me kind of thinking into my own caregiving experience to be able to express why that scene needed to be edited a certain way, or we needed to bring that in, because I was like, see, so Amy Bouchatz is a great example. That conflict for Amy Bouchatz in Unconditional, who wants to know but doesn't want to know. Who wants to know but doesn't want to know.
Yeah,
that was one of our deep editorial conversations.
Yeah, I mean, especially with Unconditional, because it's about things we couldn't see. I mean, the initial
Mental
title
health.
of that film was
trying to show that.
was Hidden Wounds, right? We were trying to show the invisible wounds that not just the recipient of care had, but also the caregivers themselves. You talk regrets, all the difficulties that they were having, and certainly, having a caregiving experience of our own, allowed us to, I think, see into that better and to be able to have a better sense of how we could show that, whether it was through the interviews or through animation, even through music. And that's actually one of the great things that the documentary has as kind of more of a artistic approach, is that it let us bring in different forms of storytelling to tell it. Even Richard was talking about the color. Even the color that you can choose to grade a scene can help to have a different emotional impact when you're looking at that shot. So every little detail of that was looked into to try and get that across in the edit.
And it was very personal. Like, there's a scene in Unconditional where my mother falls, and Alex and the editor did not want that in there, and I wanted it in there. Mm-hmm. And the reason why the producer and the editor didn't want it in there, they had their reasons. My reason was because it happens to so many of us in the caregiving context. And I didn't want to, and I just know, like, my mom is also early dementia, and would she want that? Would my dad want to see all the pictures of himself? And yes, because he was trying to get, that's what he did before he retired, to tell senior citizens, go in there and get the help. Go in and do that. So there were expressions of my own experience that were in there. Did I do any things that needed to be there because I didn't express it, right? I wasn't able to do it. So they would probably say that in my interviews, I wasn't emotional enough. That I was a little bit too stoic, or not stoic. I would say not what y'all want. Protective. Yeah. I was protective.
Guarded.
Imagine that. Do I look guarded to you? Maybe. All right.
Would you look at the time?
Yeah. You're very guarded. Yes. Yes, exactly. So then that meant that the other subjects needed to show that reality of what that might be. And that was a conscious decision too. My sister, for instance, in that space was the exact opposite. So we were a good example of that.
One more. Kathy, did you have a question? Hold up. Wait for the mic.
Hey there, Kathy Ritchie with KJZZ in Phoenix. It's sort of bouncing off what Nina was talking about. Also, my mom had dementia, and so I think about the work that I do and have done for a long time, the objectivity piece of it, because that's where I'm curious to know, like, how do you know when it's too far to cross? Like, I know there's some stories in my mind where I think about, like, my mother was in a geriatric psych ward a couple of times, and I find that story something that I could never tackle. But, like, do you have moments like that where you kind of say, like, I can't go there? And I know you've done more longer form. I'm not sure if you, like, do kind of I cover aging daily. So for me, it's more like, it's not always these long 2-year intensive projects, which is incredible. But just curious to know, like, do you have to stop yourself, or do you have to check in with someone to say, like, I don't think I can do it, or how do I get into this story? Because it's maybe crossing I don't even know what the word is, so I apologize.
No, I totally got you. If we had to edit any of this in a shorter amount of time than 2 years, or even like, we did it, if we had some edits, some of the shorts that were done in a shorter amount of time, and we were just looking at them, and they're not what they should be, or what they would be properly done to show what the experience is of the caregiver and the caregiving recipient. And so I would, journalist to journalist, we only can do what we can do in the time we got. And the fact that this thing was able to last 2 years in edit I was like, we must be like slow performers, or we're behind or something. And then after 2 years, I got to say, there's no other way we would have gotten there. And so for the shorter time frames, we have to bite off less. And I'm so with you on that. If we're not feeling quite right about it, it's okay to feel 20% it's like, it's 20% not there. Okay, let's go. 80%'s okay. But I know exactly what you're saying. There's limits to some of these big topics where we can't get it done in the amount of time that we've been given. Emotionally, that's right, and that's part of it. That's totally part of it. Like me emotionally going through this and editing it as we're going through, it did take me a long time to process some of the realities of the way my siblings and I were working, or the way my dad or my mom might see parts of the story that we had them in it, for instance. And so you've heard it before in life, and as well in what we're doing when we're covering this sort of story, is to give yourself some grace. I mean, you're going to do your best. That's the truth. So we're not ready. That's okay, and we'll do our best. And the fact that all of you are here for this is amazing on this gathering here in DC. It's really great.
It's pretty amazing that we have someone, a journalist of your stature, joining us as well. So I want to end on a very powerful note in your book, where you talk about when you had made that decision, you're going to go take care of your father, and you worried about how your editor was going to respond. And you just felt like, my career's over. They're going to just throw me out. Tell us about this remarkable sort of epiphany when the way she responded really just moved you.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because she always gets mad at me for bringing this up. So the person that hired me, her name is Yvette Miley, over at NBC and MSNBC back in 2010. And I was like, wow, this is the big break. It's great. I get to move to New York, be at 30 Rock, and I get to work Monday through 8 days a week. And this is great. I'm looking forward to this. And then my dad gets diagnosed, and we talked about that earlier, and I made some decisions personally. I'm not going to not help him, because he fought me. He taught me how to fight. I'm going to fight for him now. Got to do this. So what I do as an ex-business person is I always write the email I'm going to send after the meeting. So I was thinking, when I go in there and tell her I want to take care of my dad, she's probably going to go, great guy, love you, Richard. When you're done, come on back. That's what I thought she was going to say. So basically, my email was going to be thank you, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave for a while, then I'll come back. And so I walk in and I sit down with her, tell the story, and she's a very experienced editor. She's run some of our best affiliates across the country. Yvette's looking at her computer. I sat down. I tell her about I have to take care of my dad, and she still looking at the computer, and then she stops and he lowers her glasses and looks at me, and that's generally when I've done something wrong. She goes, Richard, I'm also a long distance caregiver as well. And my mom's in Florida, I'm in New York. And I was just like, holy Hannah, I cannot believe this is happening. And Dad, no, I was just like, this is great. And so what more? Well, she said, let's figure out how to keep you. And what we're going to do is you and I are both going to come up with 4 ideas each. She breaks out her reporter's notebook, literally, and starts writing ideas with me. And so she says, okay, this is only half an hour. We're going to meet again next week. And you have your ideas, and I'll have mine. We did. We had a plan. And she said, when you're ready, you let me know. And so a year later, I said, Yvette, we got to pull the lever. And I did not make her job easier. She did not have to do it. There's no such thing as a part-time anchor, right? What's that doing with a bad voice? And instead, what I realized was there's all these opportunities for us in our profession to be creatively kind, and she did that at that moment. She didn't blink, and it was a small thing, but a huge thing. Because she decided that. I've been on the schedule now for 7 years. And because of that, twice now, the 2 movies about caregiving, all nonprofit efforts, by the way. And then the book, when I mentioned her in the book. And the funny thing that, I didn't realize where I was emotionally in that moment. But because you have to give copies of your book to all your bosses and people at work. So I was like, I never wrote a book. I got to do this little thing. I brought copies in. I was writing a note for everybody. I was like, what am I going to say? But for Yvette, I remember I just broke open the cover. I said, "Dear Yvette, thank you for changing my life." I was like, whoa, did I just write that? "Dear Yvette, thank you for changing my life," in like 15 seconds. But she did. And so all the little decisions that we make sometimes with the people that we work with can be huge. The stories we tell, I know sometimes forget that, but especially in this space, can be huge. And so thank you for bringing that up. And she really did bring it home to me that I have to keep on keeping on.
Here's a breaking news headline. Some editors are actually human beings. So take this back with you when you go to your newsroom. Listen, this has been an extraordinary opportunity to hear from Richard Lui, hear his story, hear his advice on how we should be covering these issues. And the best news of all is I think Alex gets to keep his job. So it's a win-win.
There you go.
Listen, we need to take this opportunity to show both Richard and Alex our gratitude for ending our day on a really wonderful high note.
Thank you.